Welcome back. Now we have these really nice debug lines showing us the forward vector direction. But it would be really nice to visualize a vector and see which side of the line is the vector's head versus the tail. In other words, we'd like to draw an arrow. Now we can show a point in space with a debug point. Let's see how this works in blueprints first. So we're going to type draw debug point. And draw debug point does what it sounds like. It draws a point in space. Now let's see how this works. First, I'm going to use getActorLocation and hook that in to the position input. So draw debug point needs to know where to draw the point. Now we can specify a size, and I'm going to use 15 for the size. We'll see what that looks like. And for the color, we'll make this red. And duration, I'm just going to put 60 here. So we'll draw a point for 60 seconds. Now, if we press play, now we see the point. So notice that a debug point keeps its size constant, which means if we zoom back away from it, the point appears to get larger. It's not that it's getting larger, it's staying the same size, but those spheres are getting smaller. So that's something to keep in mind when drawing debug points. If we zoom on in, that point almost looks like it doesn't exist, and that's just due to the nature of the debug point functionality. It just stays the same size. But we can use it to visualize a point in space. So this is great. I'd like to do this in C++, however, so let's delete those nodes and hop back into Visual Studio. And we can draw a debug point, and I'd like to draw it at the end of the vector. In other words, location plus forward times 100. Now I'm going to hit enter to make some more lines. And notice if I hit enter, we're indented here. And that's because Visual Studio sees that we don't have a semicolon there, so it assumes that we're not done with this line. So even though we incorporated a semicolon into our macro and we don't need it to successfully compile, we can add a semicolon and we won't get this indentation effect. Notice as soon as I change this line, it indented, and that's because draw sphere doesn't have a semicolon either. So now that we do have semicolons on these lines, I can hit enter and it won't indent automatically for me. So something to be aware of. Now what I'd like to do is place an if check to make sure our world is valid, because draw debug point is going to need the world. And draw debug point is, you guessed it, draw debug point here in C++. Now the first input is the world, so we can pass that in. And next we need the position at which to draw the point. We're going to use this expression here, location plus forward times 100. That way we'll draw the point at the end of these debug lines. So let's go ahead and pass that in. Now next we need the size. We can use 15.f, and for the color we can use fcolor, red. And for be persistent lines, we can go ahead and pass in true, and that way we'll draw the points indefinitely. So let's go ahead and save this and head back into the editor and hot reload. And with hot reload finished, we can press play, and now we get our debug points, and this time we're drawing them at the end of those lines. So we have something that kind of looks like a vector. Now it doesn't look like an arrow, unfortunately, but that's okay. A debug point is sufficient enough to show us the end of this vector. So now we know where the start and end locations are for the vector we're drawing. So this is great. Now, just like we did with draw sphere and draw line, I'd like to make a draw point macro that we can use so we don't have to write as much code. So let's do it. We'll go into /h and define a new macro here. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new line and use #define, and we'll call this macro draw point. And draw point simply needs a location. And we'll say if get world, and we'll have our function call here, which we have here in item.cpp, so I can copy this line where we're calling draw debug point and come back to slash and simply paste it in here. Now we're calling draw debug point, and instead of world, we need to pass in get world, as world is not defined here in slash. So we're calling get world, and for the location, we're just going to use the location input to our macro. So it's up to us to provide the location that we want to draw this point at. And we'll draw it with a line thickness of 15, a color of red, and draw persistent lines will be true. So now we can simply call draw point instead of getting our world and checking it and calling draw debug point. So let's do that instead. We'll call draw underscore point, and what we'll pass in is location plus forward times 100. And I'll go ahead and add that semicolon there for convenience. Okay, so as is, this would result in the same exact behavior. So we can go ahead and press save. Now I'm going to hit save all just to save the changes both in slash and item.cpp, as we've made changes to both of those files. Now we can hot reload, and with a successful hot reload, we can press play, and we have the same functionality here. Great. Okay, so now we can always draw a vector and even see the tip of the vector by using draw line and draw point. So that's useful, but I'd really like a macro that will do both of these for me. In other words, a macro called draw vector, and that would allow me to input a starting and ending location for the vector and just draw that point at the end as a courtesy for me. So we can do that too. Let's define a new macro. Here in slash, I'm going to define a new macro called draw vector. And draw vector is going to need a start location and an end location. So we'll use start location and end location. Now the first thing we're going to do is basically the same thing that draw line does. We're going to check the world and draw the debug line. But rather than have a big long line, I'd like to define this macro over multiple lines. Here's how we do it. The first thing I'm going to do is check if get world. And then I'm going to use a backslash. Now backslash allows me to continue the definition of this macro on the next line. So the next thing I could do is add a opening curly brace. And then I can add another backslash to continue this definition on the next line. So here I could call draw debug line. So what I'm going to do is copy my function call for draw debug line, including the semicolon, and paste it here. And I'll add another backslash. And on the next line, we'll call draw debug point. So we'll copy these lines here, and we'll paste them there. Now for draw debug point in this case, I'd like to draw the debug point at the end location. So we'll use end location here. And we'll add another backslash. And on the following line, we'll close the curly braces, and that will be the end of our draw vector macro. So this is how we define macros over multiple lines like this. You have to use the slash to indicate that we're not done defining this macro. So now that we have draw vector, let's see how this works. We'll go back to item.cpp, and instead of using draw line and draw point, we're simply going to call draw vector this time. So we'll use draw vector, and for the start location, we'll use location. For the end location, we'll use location plus forward times 100, like that. And we can comment out draw line, and we can comment out draw point, and now we're just calling draw sphere and draw vector. So let's hit save all, and back in the editor, we'll hot reload. And if we hit play, we see that we have the same functionality, only this time we're drawing the line and the point, all with the use of a single macro. So draw vector is nice because now we can just pass in a start and an end point, and draw vector will draw a line and a point, showing us the vector. So now that we've made plenty of changes and we've been hot reloading the whole time, I'd like to compile our Visual Studio project. So to do that, we have to close out of the editor. We'll save everything, and I'll just hit Control B here to build my slash module. And now our changes are actually compiled here in our Visual Studio solution. Great job. I'll see you in the next lecture.